Hi, I wanted to go into Colonel Richard Henry Lee. Now, I can't really talk about Richard Henry Lee without also talking about two other ancestors of yours who were founders of Jamestown and colonial Virginia also, and they interacted with each other. These three ancestors interacted with each other, and in fact, you probably have even more ancestors that were there right around that time, but I'd like to cover three of them at once. Now, I'm going to break the videos into three because Albert told me these videos are getting too long and that if I run over 10 minutes, I'm losing people. So I'm going to break them in to do them per person, but there are three videos that I'm going to make that kind of really go together because they're all in that same environment around the same time. So this first one that I'm going to talk about. Richard Henry Lee. Richard Henry Lee, born in 1617 in England, and he's actually comes from modest beginnings. His parents, I think they're in the clothing business or something. Basically, pretty modest beginnings. He does manage, though, to go to school, go to college, and by the age of 22, he's an attorney. So he somehow comes under the wing of a very influential man, Sir Francis Wyatt. Now, I'll be talking about Sir Francis Wyatt too. Remember, he's the first colonial governor, the first royally appointed colonial governor of Virginia. By the time that he meets Richard Henry Lee, he has already served one term, and then he's gone home to deal with his father has died. Sir Francis Wyatt's father has died, and he's handling the estate. And I'm thinking perhaps this is where he meets Richard Henry Lee. Maybe Richard is he's a young attorney. Maybe this is how he comes into contact with Sir Francis Wyatt. But in any event, Wyatt becomes a mentor, and he takes Richard Lee and he brings him with him to do his next stint as governor in Jamestown. So they leave together on the boat. Sir Francis Wyatt and Richard Henry Lee leave together on the boat in 1639. Now, also on the boat with them is a young woman named Anne Constable. Now, Anne Constable is with them because her parents sent her away to be a ward of Sir Francis Wyatt, probably a family friend, because at the time, London is absolutely decimated with a plague. And by this time, she has 14 siblings, and she's lost all but 3 of them, I think, by this point. And her parents, she would lose her parents after this. So the parents make a good move by sending her away to the Americas to keep her safe, because she ends up being, one of the sole survivors of that family. So she's on the boat with them, this ward of Sir Francis Wyatt's. Well, this Anne Constable would end up marrying Richard Henry Lee. So these two that are together on this boat heading to Jamestown eventually get married and start the Lee family of America, which would be a prominent family. So going back to Richard Henry Lee, remember he's 22 at the time. They're coming over. He's just a young attorney. But once in Jamestown, he quickly rises and he becomes Attorney General to the colony, and then eventually Secretary of State of the Virginia colony, which is, in terms of power, it's right under the governor. So there's the governor, and then there's Secretary of State. So he would also become a member of the King's Council. So he serves in this capacity in various political positions, and both he and Sir Francis Wyatt were loyal supporters of King Charles I of England. What's going on over in England is that there's a bunch of civil war going on, and Oliver Cromwell seizes power over in England in 1649, and King Charles loses his head. So Lee steps down from all of his public offices, and a year later, in 1650, Richard Lee, your ancestor, makes a voyage to the Netherlands to report the colony of Virginia's loyal adherence to Charles II, who he believed was the legitimate heir to the throne of England. So I don't know what happens, but within 2 years later, it's Lee that's negotiating with England a capitulation of Virginia to the Crown of England, and he's satisfied with the terms that are laid out. So I don't know what happens, but he makes it work, and Virginia once again is loyal to England. So after this, he steps down from public office, except he's a House of Burgess member, which he still does for years. He becomes High Sheriff of the colony, and he's a colonel in the militia, which is why I refer to him as Colonel Richard Henry Lee. He's a colonel in the militia. The militia at that time was mostly dealing with Indian issues. I mean, they were attacked. Jamestown was attacked several times. While he's doing all this, while he's serving in these different capacities, he's also manages to amass a lot of land, and he becomes a big tobacco planter. And he has interest in a shipping company, which transports, he's a slave trader, and he is a trader of indentured servants too. Lee was in the fur trading business as well, so with the local Indians. So because he makes such a good business with these Indians and gets a rapport with them, he decides to build his home on the outskirts of settlement of the Virginia colony at the time. So he's the first white man to settle in the northern neck of Virginia. By the 1650s, so he's in his 30s by this point. By the 1650s, he is spending half his time in Virginia and half of his time in London. So just handling affairs, doing business in both places. And so he buys a home in London in 1658. So he's around 41 when he buys this home in London. And he brings his whole family over to London simply because he wants the younger kids to have the education that London can provide, that the colonies cannot. His two older sons are already at Oxford at this time. So he wants his younger children to have that benefit of a good education. But even so, this whole time, even when he's living in London and he's taken his family over to London, he's always said he wants all of them to go back to the Americas. That's his end goal. And in fact, he writes it into his will that when he dies, they will sell the English property, the English home, and they'll all go to America. And which is indeed what happens when he dies. That does indeed happen. So at the time of his death, Richard Henry Lee was the largest landholder in the colony of Virginia. He had over 13,000 acres and believed by many to have been the richest as well at his death. His descendants include you guys and President Zachary Taylor and General Robert E. Lee. And actually, two of his descendants signed the Declaration of Independence. There were two brothers, Richard Henry Lee, obviously named for him, and Francis Lightfoot Lee, and both of those, they were brothers, the only brothers to sign the Declaration of Independence. So Richard Henry Lee is kind of an interesting character because he's an example of what the promise of America is. He comes from humble beginnings, and when he dies, actually after living a very short life, because he only lived from 1617 to 1664, he's the wealthiest man and the largest landholder in the colony. So this is why America starts to become as a place known as where you can make something of yourself, even if you come from humble beginnings.